And thanks so much for everyone joining us. Welcome to our second webinar of our 2021-2022 series. Today, our therapist, Maddy Lawler, is going to talk to us about how to manage kids' behaviors when they're in a group setting, especially in a classroom. I know a lot of you are teachers, and we made a lot of this content for teachers. It is, however, also applicable for parents who are managing kids in a group like a birthday party. I've definitely had to do that before, and things get a little bit wild. But then also for camp counselors and kids class leaders and things like that. Sunday school. Oh my goodness. I am Mandy White-Ajmani. I am the owner of Small Brooklyn Psychology. We are a group psychology practice at Industry City in Brooklyn, New York, where we offer therapy and neuropsychological assessment to people of all ages, all backgrounds, and all psychological concerns. You can see our clinicians there across the bottom. These are some new pictures, so we're very happy to be able to spotlight them. It's a good looking group. That is me, and then Natasha Brown, Jill DePietro, Sam Janit, Deidre Edwards, Nav Gill, Ben Janitis, Maddy Lawler, and Danielle DeFilippo. And so Maddy, who is our amazing therapist, is here with me today, and she's going to be leading this webinar. We all have experience working with people across the lifespan, but we also have special training and experience to do assessments and treatment with children and parents, even down to babies and toddlers. This is our second webinar of the year's monthly series. Recordings for our previous webinars from last year, and then the one that we did last month, that was with Ben Janitis, who was talking about how parents can help kids with anxiety. There's a lot of things that parents can do, even when kids aren't directly in treatment. There's a lot of things that that we can do to help anxiety. So all of those recordings are actually on our website and on our YouTube channel. You can find them at smallbrooklyn.com/services/talks. This series is media sponsored by Park Slope Parents, which is our amazing Brooklyn-based group. Is a huge community resource. If you're a parent here in Brooklyn and you aren't on Park Slope Parents, I highly recommend it. It's been such a resource for me personally and my family, so many others that I know, but then also the business and being able to network career-wise to get advice from people who are also in the healthcare field, other kid and baby business owners, and there's so much. There's baby groups and events and all kinds of resources like this where we are sharing information from experts. And so please do check them out. Stay tuned for our next webinar, which is going to be next month, December 8th. That's going to be led by our neuropsychologist, Natasha Brown. She's going to talk about concussions, what they are, when to worry about them, and what to do after a concussion has occurred. Now, during this talk, if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box. I'm going to be monitoring them while Maddy talks. And so at the end, we'll save time for questions and answers. So I will make sure to try and get to your questions as much as possible. We'll also be answering some of the questions that people put in the registration box there. And so now I want to introduce Maddy Lawler. She's a licensed social worker who graduated from Hunter College's Silberman School of Social Work. As a former special educator at the Ideal School of Manhattan, Maddy incorporates real-world practical knowledge and advocacy interest in her work. She has extensive experience and training in trauma treatment using trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, which is TFCBT. And she's worked intensively with children and adolescents with behavioral, learning, and social difficulties at the Child Mind Institute and other organizations before she luckily came to us. And now we have all of her, and we're very happy about that. She uses a mix of a lot of acronyms. So cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, supportive parenting for anxious childhood emotions, that's SPACE. It's a parent-oriented treatment to help anxious kids. Parent management training, PMT, parent-child interaction therapy, PCIT. And so she uses all of that in working with both kids and parents. And she's also happy to see adults in individual therapy too. Maddy sees clients virtually and in person, it's up to you. And she is supervised by one of our behavioral experts, Jill DePietro. So Maddy, we're really looking forward to your talk, and I'll come back in a little bit and we'll talk about some questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mandy. All right. So I am going to get started here. Thank you. Thank you, Mandy, for introducing me. Like Mandy mentioned, I am a former educator, and so this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. And so I want to make sure that other people in classroom settings or other group settings have some tools and strategies when you're dealing with kids in groups. So the goals for today will to make sure you have that toolkit both on the classroom level and on the individual level, and then also giving some strategies to prevent behavior escalation in the first place. All right, so I wanted to start off by talking about bias in the classroom. So we know that behavior is really environmental, right? Kids are responding to different environments and the people that make up those environments as well. And so thinking about who you are and what you're bringing to that environment is crucially important. And especially thinking about things like racial and gender bias and how that shows up in classroom or group settings. Stereotypes we think of like the misbehaved boys. We also know the research from recent federal studies show us that Black boys are suspended or expelled at a rate of 3 times that of their white peers. So the bias is there, it's systemic, and it's also interpersonal. So thinking about how what you're bringing into the classroom environment and how that's contributing to the way that you're managing behaviors is a really important foundation for us to think about when we're using these strategies. So I would just encourage everyone, even if you're not in a classroom setting, even in groups, thinking about how your identity is impacting the way that you are managing behaviors. All right, so I wanted to start off by thinking about how we define behaviors and how we can determine their function. So when we're thinking about behaviors, we want to think about them in specific, observable, and measurable terms, right? So instead of just they were bad or they were good, we want to make sure that we break that down, which we'll do more explicitly in the upcoming slides. But again, that's so that we understand exactly what behaviors we're looking for as the adults in the situation. And that helps the kids understand what to expect as well. I know Mandy went through a lot of acronyms already about the different interventions that I use, but I'm going to introduce one to you right now, which is SEAT, S-E-A-T. This is an acronym that we use to think about the different functions of the behavior, what's causing it to thrive, why is this happening, right? What's motivating that behavior? The S stands for sensory. It feels good, right? The kids, someone's jumping on a couch, they might be getting some sensory feedback from that. Escape is our E. They're trying to get out of something. That might be pretty typical with some things that happen in the classroom or other group activities as well. The A stands for attention. We'll go into this one in a lot of detail because especially in a group settings, there's lots of places for people to get attention from, not just the adult or a sibling in the home, but several others as well. So that's, as it mentions on the slide, to gain an interaction, right? To get some attention from the adult or the other peers in the room as well. And the T in SEAT stands for tangible, to obtain something specific, right? So that might be, if they're wanting to watch TV, they might be after the clicker, and that's kind of motivating the behavior in that way. And same with specific examples of tangible items that they might want in a classroom or other group setting as well. So when we're thinking about what behaviors come up and the functions that they serve, that's going to impact the way that we manage them, right? And so, of course, there's plenty of interventions to think about sensory ways. We're mostly going to be focusing on escape and attention today. But in general, we want to be thinking about what functions the behavior is serving and how we can address them. So this is our hierarchy of the behavior techniques, our little upside down triangle here. And it's represented this way for a reason. We want to be starting at the top, using those as much as possible, and then working our way down the hierarchy, right? So we're starting with the positive antecedents, which we'll go into. We'll go through each of these 5 strategies, but in general, we're starting at the top, using as much as possible, and then working our way down. So when we are thinking about positive antecedents, we're thinking about preparing the scene, setting the stage for success, right? So what are ways that we can set kids up to be successful in classroom and other spaces? And this is not a cure-all by any means. It's not to say that once you do one of these things, it's going to change, but it will give the children more opportunity to succeed in those spaces and more opportunity to show you the positive behaviors that you're looking for. And so there's a couple of ideas on the side over here that I want to go through for that. One would be creating a visual routine for kids to kind of know what's coming next. This might be something that is already used in classrooms, especially for younger kids, but it's helpful for kids across the lifespan to understand what's coming next. Children have not developed their frontal lobe yet. And so when we think about all the things that are part of the frontal lobe and executive functioning, things like planning, self-regulation, right? All of those things, those are things that kids need help with just inherently because that part of their brain isn't developed yet. And so we're trying to think of ways that we can help them by supporting them through visuals or other sorts of tools to help them anticipate what's coming next, right? And so that's even something that you can do in the home, right? Like if you had a list of morning activities, right? Brushing your teeth, getting dressed, same with the nighttime routine. All of that's really helpful for kids to understand which behaviors you're looking for. And again, we're going to want to make sure that those behaviors are defined explicitly in specific terms and measurable ones so that we can follow up on them appropriately. And you can do this in birthday parties and play dates and other settings too, right? Some parents use a whiteboard, ways that you can kind of spell out the expectations, the routines for whatever the activity is. Similarly, you want to make sure that you're establishing behavior expectations for each activity, right? So what does that look like? It could look like when you come to PE class, you're expected to be in your sneakers and you sit on your spot and you wait for teacher instructions. And you want to be explicit with that too of, are they allowed to talk during that time, right? Or are they expected to be quiet? Because there's probably different expectations in a gym class than there would be in a science class, right? Maybe in science, you're expected to come into your seat, take out your notebook, copy down the do now on the board. It's the same with when you're at the playground or other sorts of play dates. When we go to the park, we have a safe body, we use kind words, and we listen to parent directions, right? Even those simple expectations, which we know is kind of baseline and feels status quo for kids, it's important to make sure that you're sharing those expectations along the way, right? Again, thinking about that frontal lobe and how we can support them with tools that they might be missing because of their brain development. Another helpful way to set up the scene for success in this way is to provide information rather than commands. Kids are given commands all day long. They're asked to do a lot, and they're not even really asked, they're demanded, right? So if you think about a school setting, there's not a lot of options about what you get to do. And so commands can be really demanding on the child, right? Having to perform, having to do something. Instead, it can be helpful to provide information. It's time to clean up rather than please put your materials away. Or it's time to line up for recess instead of please stand on this spot, right? Because then that could create kind of a back and forth, which we'll go into as well. With all of that too, you want to give transition warnings when possible, especially when it's a less preferred activity. If you know that leaving the park is not fun for your child, you're going to try to give transition warnings, especially if it's reinforcing to be at the park with friends in a group. So with all of this, you're anticipating, planning ahead, and expecting the bumps along the way, right? So again, it's not to say that giving yourself all of this proper setup is going to be a cure-all and is going to change the game entirely, but it will give you way more opportunities to see those positive behaviors and reinforce them appropriately, which we'll go through as well. And then when the bumps come up, you'll be better prepared as well. So when we're thinking about some of those commands that we place, demands that we place on children by giving commands, we think about the coercive cycle. And this is also something that shows up not just in classrooms, but obviously in parent-child relationships. And we want to think about how this plays out and how we can break it. So the coercive cycle would start with a child engaging in a problem behavior. Let's say they're refusing to participate in a class activity. Then the teacher would have an emotional response to that, right? Because it's disruptive. And so they would yell at the child escalates back, they scream and throw their materials. In response, the teacher continues to escalate in order to respond to that behavior, and then they send the children to the principal's office. The teacher ends up either giving up, angry, or both in that situation. And we can think about the way this shows up in parent-child relationships too, right? Say you're at the park and they aren't listening to your instructions, right? Especially when you're maybe managing a play date, right? And then they're rude to you, they're rude to their friend. It gets into this escalation and it results in a lot of headbutting, right? So again, asking a lot of those demands, we can work towards using information instead to not get into that back and forth. But in general, when we think about this cycle, we're thinking about how teacher-child escalation or parent-child escalation is continually being reinforced, right? And so if your response to a problem behavior is always going to be an emotional response, it's going to lead to escalation, right? And so again, thinking about what you're bringing to an environment, modeling that calm is a really effective way to break the cycle, which we're going to go into here. So when a teacher or a parent learns the appropriate response to a problem behavior, it's much easier for the child to de-escalate. And really importantly, it maintains that relationship, right? It keeps the relationship intact between the parent and the child, or the teacher and the child. And then this reinforces positive skills and adaptive problem solving skills as well, right? So if we're able to keep our cool in those situations, which I know is sometimes easier said than done, but if we're able to keep our cool in those situations and respond appropriately, then that will show that will model for the child as well adaptive coping skills and adaptive ways to engage in those kinds of discussions and conversations. And with all of this too, we want to be thinking about the relationship, which is so crucially important and makes the rest of the strategies on our hierarchy easier. So if we're able to give children one-on-one time, and that's for parents, but it's also for teachers as well. The research shows that just 5 minutes a day is effective in maintaining that positive relationship with the child, right? And so what will be crucial is for teachers to find opportunities to engage in one-on-one time with each of the students. Again, it sounds daunting, but even if you're thinking about doing that in bite-sized pieces, that will help the keep the relationship between you and the student warm and intact. And it's the same with parents too, right? Because children are given these demands all day, and there are times where we need to give commands and make sure that everyone's being safe, but we want to make sure we're laying that foundation. And in order to lay that foundation, it does involve that individual relationship, right? Thinking about your favorite teachers were probably ones that you did feel that really close connection with, right? And so trying to model that and cultivate that with your students' relationships as well, and in the home. And it's the same if you're on a group play date with other kids, right? Even checking in with the other children individually will be really important in terms of if you do feel like you need to manage other behaviors. So that's kind of laying the foundation in terms of the relationship building, also some of those positive antecedents where you're setting expectations and laying out the routines. The two main skills I want to go into next are praise and active ignoring. So praise is a really important tool. And when we're using praise, we want to be able to give specific labeled praise for the positive behaviors that you're trying to increase. And so we'll go through some examples of this, but it's not just good job, it's good job doing what, right? And what exactly were you looking for? The praise has the benefit of pointing out the behaviors that you want to see, cueing kids into that, and having them remember exactly what you're looking for. And it also creates a warm relationship because you're focusing on the positives, right? Going back to that foundational piece, that's a really important tool that you can use in those interactions. In terms of our other skills in order to reinforce positive behavior, another fun acronym, PRIDE, right? So we're starting off with the P, with praise, and then we're also going to be thinking about reflections. Reflections are just when we're reflecting back, imitating those appropriate verbalizations, right? So if a kid is telling a story, instead of just ahhing them, right, using specific words, Spider-Man, raccoon, turtle, right? Even just that one word feels like an appropriate reflection and shows them that you're listening. It also really helps to build language skills by reinforcing appropriate speech. Imitation as well is an important skill that you can use in play. Shows kids that you're paying attention, builds that cooperation, right? If you're engaged in the play, it's much easier for an adult to model those skills than it would be for another child, right? So as much as you can get in there and kind of show those pro-social skills that you're trying to increase, that will be really useful as well. Behavior descriptions are another great skill that you can use in order to show kids that you're paying attention, hold their focus, right? Because if you're describing what they're doing, then they can stay engaged, right? They might need that extra verbal feedback through your description in order to stay engaged. And the E stands for enjoyment. This should be fun, right? They're your kid, or they're your kid's friend, or they're your students. And so showing that you can genuinely enjoy yourself and reflecting that warmth is just like putting money in the bank, like that one-on-one time, right? When we're thinking about using these skills, spending one-on-one time with kids, it's laying that foundation, putting money in the bank for when we do need to use some of the tougher skills later on, right? And so kids will know when it's not genuine, but trying to get engaged in their play or in conversations and other interactions is a really important way to reinforce behaviors as you see them. So let's focus on praise a little bit by thinking about how to make those praises super effective. Again, we're thinking about making them specific, and we're only praising positive behavior. I know that seems obvious, but it's important to make sure that we are, sarcasm is a tool that a lot of teachers use as well. And thinking about ways to make sure that we are focusing on the positives, avoiding those don'ts, the stops, and the no's, right? So instead of no yelling, we want to be thinking about asking them to use a quiet voice, right? So instead of thanks for not hitting someone, right? Thanks for using a safe body. There are some examples down here, obviously. Thanks for listening to my direction the first time. Great job being so patient. And again, you want to be genuine with those praises. You want to make sure that you are praising when you do see the positives, and that they can tell when you are being genuine and authentic with that as well. When you're giving praise, it helps to give the praise immediately after the behavior occurs and as close to the child as possible, right? Instead of shouting across the park or the room, making sure you go up to them and point out the behavior that you noticed. That will help with that kind of correlation between this is a positive behavior and this positive reinforcement with praise will help increase those behaviors as well. You can also use nonverbal reinforcers. A lot of times parents will say, or teachers will say that the kids don't really respond well to praise. It embarrasses them, or, we want to think about ways that we can be reinforcing non-verbally with a high five or a thumbs up or a pat on the back, right? Thinking about what fits for the children in your life and what would be an appropriate way. But the point here is that we're noticing positive behaviors and reinforcing them appropriately. When we're giving praises, we do want them to be frequent. We want to have that one-to-one ratio. If we're giving a direction or another sort of command, we also want to be using praise, right? And following up with when they listen to that direction. We want to make sure that we're keeping that one-to-one ratio in order to maintain that positivity. And I think when teachers and parents are able to reframe and focus on the positives in this way, not only does it increase the positive behaviors, but it also helps with your outlook on the way that some of the behaviors are playing out in the classroom. So these are some examples of what problem behaviors might be happening in your classroom, or even on the playground, arguing about rules, destroying materials. And again, we're trying to focus on the positive opposite behavior, eliminating the don'ts, the no's, and the stops, right? So instead of thanks for not arguing about that, thank you for accepting that, right? So trying to flip the behavior in terms of positive language so that we can reinforce it, right? Because if we say, thanks for not arguing about that, then we are using the negative, right? So it doesn't point out the behavior in that way. And kids also have that recency effect, right? Where if they hear not arguing, then they're going to hear arguing, and that's going to cue them into that behavior. So trying to focus on the positives there too. Okay. Now we're going to think about active ignoring. So when we're thinking about attention, this is one of those things that makes total sense on paper and is much harder to practice in person, right? So we think about paying attention to negative behaviors, those behaviors are going to get reinforced and those behaviors are going to increase. Whereas if we don't focus, whereas if we take our attention away from positive behaviors, those behaviors are going to go down. And so with that, it's really in our nature to be problem solvers, right? Like if you think about the park or the classroom, you're mostly on the lookout for when someone's crying or yelling, right? Or when there seems to be a disagreement so that you can kind of jump in and help out and problem solve, right? But what that shows is that up until that point, all this positive behavior that was going on, sharing, safe body, good listening, using materials appropriately, all of that's gone unnoticed, right? And instead we're focusing on the negative behavior. So it makes sense that that's a behavior that would increase. Instead, we want to think about flipping that, right? And starting to focus on paying attention to the positive behaviors. And that's one way, of course, through praise and other ways that that behavior is going to strengthen and increase. And when we withdraw our attention away from negative behaviors, those behaviors will reduce or decrease. So we're kind of thinking about flipping the, changing the paradigm, right? Flipping it on its head and thinking about what are ways that I can be on the lookout for positive behaviors, right? So instead of focusing on these negatives, instead of trying to catch kids being bad, we want to try to flip that and have catch them being good, right? Which is, again, easier said than done, because when things are going well and they're being good, things are just status quo, right? And so we don't feel like we need to intervene. But those are perfect opportunities to follow up with that specific labeled praise to increase some of the behaviors that we're trying to focus on. And so the way to think about active or planned ignoring is withdrawing your attention from those negative behaviors. And again, here we're thinking about minor misbehaviors like arguing, whining, interrupting. Those are ones that, you know, again, we can think about the difference between a classroom and a playground or play date setting. But those are ones where we are withdrawing our attention, which might mean looking away. It might mean stepping into another space. Whatever it is, we're not engaging with the problem behavior, and instead we're waiting for the positive opposite. So it's not just that we're withdrawing our attention, we're actually paying a lot of attention, right? And we're paying a lot of attention to when the positive behavior comes up, right? So we're waiting. So if someone is whining, we're waiting until they use a nice tone of voice. Someone's interrupting, we're waiting until the hand goes up. And so that's the key part here. That's what makes this active or planned, is that we're following up with the praise for that positive opposite behavior. With this, it may get worse before it gets better, right? Because now kids are learning a totally new way to that you're addressing things. And so with that, you might see that the yelling gets louder, the interrupting, because they're trying to get your attention, right? So going back to the functions of behavior, we're thinking about attention-based behaviors. And so they're going to try everything in their power to get your attention, right? They might start throwing things at you, they might start yelling louder, they might interrupt more, right? Until they can get your attention. And so what's really important here is to ride that wave, right? Is to say, all right, I know I hear them calling out and I'm going to ignore. And I think that this is something that understandably teachers have a hard time with, because there might be other people in the class that are reinforcing that behavior with attention. And that's where modeling is that really important tool, right? Where if you're not paying attention to the negative behaviors, and we'll talk about ways to do this in a classroom setting, and you're focusing on positive behaviors, the kids are going to pick up on that. But that extinction burst where, you know, you might see the behaviors increase, the negative behaviors increase before they get better, is a really typical response to this. And so just encouraging educators, group leaders, parents to kind of ride that wave and be prepared to wait for the positive opposite behavior. Again, really tricky, because mostly when someone's yelling, we're just waiting for them to stop and all we feel is relief. But when you feel that relief, following up with a positive opposite for that behavior, thank you so much for using an indoor voice. So this is one way that you can kind of use that differential attention in a classroom or a group setting, right? Even if there's siblings in the home. When you're noticing other kids calling out, you can point out the positive behaviors of other kids in the class as well, right? Here's Chloe raising her hand. I love how Chloe's raising her hand. And now maybe this blonde kid is Mark, right? I love how Mark is raising a quiet hand. Okay, now thank you, Layla, for raising a quiet hand, and kind of calling out the positive behaviors as you see them. Again, it's reminding kids about that expectation of what the behavior is that you're looking for. Ideally, you've already set them up for that with your behavior expectations, but it's that reminder along the way as well. All right, so our third technique is going to be talking about effective directions. So there are lots of opportunities that to give instructions throughout the day for kids in school settings and in other group settings as well. And so with that, we want to think about how we're giving instructions in a way that will lead kids to succeed and to comply with those instructions as well, right? So being clear and straightforward. Please sit on the carpet instead of, can you come sit on the carpet, right? Because when we ask that question, they get the choice. They can say no, right? So if you say, can you come sit on the carpet? And they say no, then now you're getting back into that coercive cycle, right? Because now you're upset because they're not doing something and you're following through on that, right? So making sure that those commands are direct, right? Not a question, and making them really specific and straightforward. We also want to make sure that we're asking age appropriate things, right? And I think most, teachers, it's in your training to understand that developmentally, but, for parents, it might be a refresher, especially if you're dealing with kids of different ages in terms of what they can actually perform, right? So saying, we wouldn't ask a room of kindergartners to tie their shoes because that's not a guarantee that everyone knows how to do that. And so we want to make sure we're giving directions that kids can actually comply with. We also want to make sure those instructions are given one at a time, right? Instead of put on your shoes, your hat, and your gloves, trying to break that down, right? And so also breaking it down in terms of saying, instead of saying just clean up or be careful, what exactly does that mean? How can we break that down more explicitly? Again, we're thinking about it in the positive opposite by avoiding the don'ts, the no's, and the stops, by telling them what we want them to do. And then we're waiting for follow through, right? That's another example of when we're waiting. And then once we see the behavior, we're following up with that specific and labeled praise. We also want to make sure that we are modeling that appropriate response, keeping your cool, right? It's very frustrating when you're asking kids to do something and they don't. And so we want to make sure that you're practicing keeping calm in those situations. That also helps prevent yelling, because we don't want kids to think, I only have to do something when my teacher yells, right? We want this to be kind of that baseline when an instruction is given. So as you're giving an effective direction, it can be really helpful to give information ahead of time, right? Saying, okay, class, it's time to clean up. Then giving the direction, please put the crayons in this container, and then following up with that specific praise. Great job listening so quickly, right? Again, we're praising listening with giving directions rather than putting crayons in containers, because ultimately that's not the most important behavior that we're looking for. We're looking for the listening, and that's something we can reinforce in lots of opportunities throughout the day. And when you can give information first, it's going to increase the chances that they comply with what you're asking for as well. As opposed to giving the information later, you can get back into that coercive cycle, that back and forth as well. Well, why do we have to do this, right? So trying to give the information up front, it makes sense, right? They'll be more likely to follow through. All right, now I want to think about reinforcement systems. So we're going to talk about reinforcement systems that you can use on a school or class-wide level, as well as an individual level. So this might be when you've exhausted all of your other skills, you've set the stage for success, you're praising and active ignoring, you're making sure you're giving effective directions, and you're still noticing that there's certain behaviors that are falling through the cracks, right? With that, you would want to start by targeting 1 to 3 specific behaviors. That's for the child's benefit and your benefit as well, right? So it's a lot to keep track of, especially, if you have several going on in the class. And so you want to make sure that you are focusing on one target behavior at a time. You want to be phrasing that in that positive, what to do, positive opposite. And you want to make sure that you're giving them lots of opportunities to demonstrate this behavior so that you can reinforce them, right? So there might be certain instances where a child has a really hard time entering the lunchroom. That might be like a one-time thing that you're able to reinforce, but you also want to make sure that you're finding behaviors that you can reinforce consistently, right? Something like listening or keeping a calm body, things that would happen in multiple instances throughout the day, and making sure with all of that that it's really explicitly defined for them in terms of what behavior you're looking for. What does following directions mean, right? Is that, listening the first time, eyes on the teacher? What exactly are you looking for in that situation? I'll show you some examples of how to personalize behavior charts to make sure that kids have some buy-in, right? We'll talk about that with the reinforcements themselves as well. But you want to, make it enticing for them. You want them to buy into it because this is ultimately to your benefit and theirs as well in terms of reinforcing that. And we'll talk about different rewards we can use. And you'd want to create a reward menu that they have buy-in for as well. That goes back to the ownership and the effort. When you're implementing the chart, you want to try to start off with an achievable level, right? So you don't want to give a behavior that they won't be able to do, right? So you want to start off with that high rate of success because that will increase buy-in over time as well. And so you can use prompts to demonstrate the behaviors that you're looking for in order to achieve that level of success. And again, with points or any sort of reinforcement, you're always using praise too. It's never just the point. You want to make sure you're reinforcing that positively as well. And then this is meant to be flexible, right? You're reviewing it, you're monitoring it, you're revising. If you set the bar too high, right, and it doesn't feel achievable, you can revise it, bring it back down, right? And review the successes with the child each day so that they understand what their positive behaviors. Again, this goes back to that positive relationship as that really core foundation for teacher-child and parent-child interactions. Having that positive piece of it and then revising as progress is made or if you need to make any changes. So when we're thinking about how change is happening, we want to think about what reinforcers we're using. They need to be rewarding, immediate, contingent, and consistent. And so if the reinforcer isn't rewarding, right, if they don't care about a pizza party, right, then it's not going to work. So you want to make sure you're using reinforcers that are rewarding for them. You also want to use reinforcers that can be given as immediately as possible, right? So again, we'll talk about ways that you might be working up towards it, but you want to be thinking about how you can give rewards immediately following the behavior because that will, again, draw that correlation. And if you're using something like a point or a token system, that should be given, even if the reward comes later that they're cashing in on. But again, that's going to be the stronger chance that you have a behavior change when they can directly relate the reinforcement to the behavior itself. And if this is not a bribe, right? So it's not saying, I will give you a pizza party if you behave for Miss Lawler today, right? It's waiting for the positive behaviors explicitly defined, not just behave, right? And then you're following through with that reward contingent on the behavior happening, right? So if you say, I'm looking for a calm, safe body, that means that your feet are on the floor, your hands are in your lap, and your voice is quiet. And then once you see that behavior, then you're reinforcing it. And also the most important thing with really all of these strategies is just consistency, right? And so kids would need to be learning this, again, back to that frontal lobe development, those executive functioning skills. So we want to be trying to reinforce it as consistently as possible. Sometimes kids are reacting more to inconsistency than anything else, right? So thinking about ways that you can establish those consistent expectations and then also reinforce consistently as well. So these are some examples of reinforcers. We talked a lot about praise and nonverbal options for that as well. There's obviously also material reinforcers in terms of fidget toys and prizes or different privileges like going to visit another classroom or getting, screen time or game time, as well as token systems. I know a lot of schools use PBIS or other sorts of, cash or points, ways that you can rack up and exchange those for other types of reinforcement, like on a reward menu. With this, and we'll talk about this with consequences too, this is going to be really contingent on your school's policies. And also, again, if you're not in the school setting, if you're thinking about this more in social groups, what you're comfortable with, right? So there might be, certain schools that are totally okay with having a prize box or some other sort of reinforcement, and others that don't. There might be parents that differ on that as well. So you're just trying to think about what is comfortable for you that you can implement consistently and realistically as well. So this is one example of a behavior plan that you might use for a class that's having a hard time in math, right? So if we do good listening during math class, we can play a game. And then you're explicitly defining what good listening means, right? It means my eyes are on the teacher, my body is safe, and my voice is at an indoor volume. It's really helpful to role play some of these too, so especially with younger kids, so that you're really explicit about what is an indoor voice, what is a safe body. And then in this, they could, earn stickers for a game each day, right? Or a longer game if they work their way up. And so you can kind of be flexible with that as well. This is an example of an individualized behavior chart. Obviously, there's weekend days included on here. And so this would be more for parents, or, if the parents are implementing it as well, of course, you could just take out the weekend days if you're using it in the classroom. But again, you have the behavior listed, the description explicitly defined, ideally already role played with someone as well. And then you're this would be a token system where you're racking up points and cashing in twice a week. And again, this is, was designed for someone who likes Barbies and rainbows and unicorns. Again, kind of making it personalized for kids in that situation too, so that they have the buy-in. All right, so when we're thinking about consequences, as I mentioned before, you want to be thinking about what's in line with your school's culture and practices, or what's in line with your family's school culture and practices, and then what is realistic and what can you apply consistently. And the main part of this is planning those consequences in advance. That might be part of the expectation setting that you do as well, right? So that kids know, if I hurt, then I get a timeout, right? If I call out in class, then I lose 5 minutes off of recess time. Whatever that looks like, you want to make sure that it's established in advance and communicated to kids in advance as well. And again, so this also prevents, parents that say, if you do this, we're not going to the birthday party, but you've already bought the gift, RSVP'd, and they're really looking forward to it. And you really don't want to threaten the birthday party in the first place, but now you feel like you have to follow through because they didn't do it, right? So trying to understand what consequences you have already built in that you can implement consistently. And when you're giving the consequence, you want to do so calmly. Again, that goes back to the modeling piece as well. And you're trying to use these as minimally as possible, right? This is the bottom of our hierarchy. We don't want to be using these all the time. We want to make sure we've exhausted all of our other skills before we're getting to the consequence piece. And we're trying to use those immediately, but also immediately when the behavior occurs, right? So if there's calling out, immediately administer the consequence so that, again, they can draw that correlation. It's just going to increase the likelihood that you'll see a behavior change as well. And the consequences should be in small doses, right? We're not trying to say that you get no recess for the rest of the month, or that's it for screen time for the rest of the year, now that we're hitting November, right? So you want to be thinking about ways that you can have it in small doses. You don't want to lose all your bargaining chips. And what we also know is that consequences are not as effective as the positive techniques in reinforcing this behavior, right? And they're only effective in combination with praise and other positive behaviors as well. And so, we want to make sure that we're resetting after we deliver that consequence to keep up that 1-to-1 ratio. Again, thinking about consistency as well as, how feasible you're able to administer the consequence at the time. We also want to think about how some consequences, like being sent to the principal's office or leaving the park, can be reinforcing for some of those like escape motivations as well, right? Like if they're trying to get out of class and then you send them to the principal's office, they're leaving class, right? So that's ultimately more reinforcing than another consequence in that situation. So these are the different types of consequences. Natural is the natural result of a problem behavior, right? So if a child was playing with a toy and it breaks and we don't replace it, right? That's a natural consequence of breaking something. It's broken. Then we have the logical consequences, right? If a teenager posts something inappropriate, then the account's disabled. Kind of makes sense. We can also think about consequences in terms of response cost, which would be removal of something when that behavior is engaged in, right? So like calling out, that was one of the examples in terms of losing recess time or having unsafe behavior at the park and loss of screen time or choice time or something like that. And then, again, making sure that you're consistent and that that's expected, right? So that they understand when they call out, that's when they lose that privilege. And then lastly, timeout, which would be a removal from the activities, and crucially also your attention, right? So it's not just going to sit in the chair, it's that they're not getting any feedback while they're sitting in the chair in timeout, right? Or the park bench, right? Having that removal from activities, and also the types of interactions that would be reinforcing for more attention seeking behaviors as well. And so some schools have timeout procedures, others use response cost consequences. Again, each family is different as well. So you really want to think about what is already in line with what you do and how you can make it more effective by using it immediately, consistently, and minimally. All right, so just to review, our 5 techniques were using positive antecedents, setting up the stage for success, praising positive behaviors, actively ignoring negative ones, and following up with praise when we see the positive, giving effective directions, implementing reinforcement systems, and consequences. And again, we're trying to start as much as possible at the top and work our way down there. These are just some resources I use for the presentation. And of course, we'll go through some of the questions that we've either sent to Mandy or that were sent beforehand. But we are always here as well if there are, if you feel like some of these behaviors, you're not able to implement them consistently. We do work a lot with parents to help with coaching in those scenarios and school consultations as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Maddy. I really appreciate, it was a fantastic talk. And then I also just really love doing these talks because I learned so much personally. So thanks very much.
Wonderful.
I'm going to share this information far and wide.
Perfect.
So if anybody has any questions that you want to be addressed right now, please feel free to send them in the Q&A box. And I will moderate them and ask them to Maddy. But first I want to start with talking about ignoring. So, as you said, ignoring is really powerful, removing attention from kids, and then, I guess giving the attention back when the kids show the opposite that you want to see. How do you, I know you said during the talk that if you are reinforcing the positive behaviors and you're ignoring the negative behaviors, that kids will get it. But do you think that there's also any utility in sort of announcing to the class, maybe as you're setting all this stuff up in the first time, that when kids don't follow instructions or whatever terminology you want to use, that you will ignore them? Do you think that helps at all? I think my question stems from, you can talk about this more generally, it stems from the idea that I know some kids will interpret ignoring as almost aggressive from the teacher, and you'll have this extinction burst. But I wonder whether there's anything to do to help mitigate that for kids so they don't feel just dismissed and unloved.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great question. And I think that it's certainly, again, in that expectation setting phase, thinking about like, okay, I'm waiting for a quiet hand, right? Like that's certainly something that you can say so that they understand that, when they have a quiet hand, then they will get the attention, or then they will be responded to, right? So it's kind of, setting up those if then statements, like if you have a quiet hand, then I will call on you. And that's kind of in that initial phase. But I think your point is really well taken in terms of that relationship with teachers and students as well. And so thinking about, again, kind of how you can put your money in the bank, right? Like how can you have that foundation, the positive relationship with the teacher and the child, so that when you do ignore the negative behaviors, that they don't take it as that personal affront, right? Where they say,
Good point.
Oh, well, Miss Lawler always pays attention to me. And so, I noticed she's pointing out that, Chloe's raising her hand or Mark is raising his hand. All right, like putting it together that way. And so I think certainly in the setup expectation of, people, if you raise your hand, then you can contribute to the class discussion. And then you can always say, I'm waiting for a quiet hand, but say it once, because you don't want that to be giving so much attention back into it. And so once you say it once, then they know, okay, that's why she's not calling on me. That's why she's ignoring me, right? And again, really going back to that foundational piece too, of having that positive teacher child relationship will kind of mitigate some of that animosity. And I think it's really easy with kids with behavior concerns to, have a negative relationship with their teachers or their parents, right? Like I talk about that a lot with families and teachers too, where it's really annoying, right? And so it's really hard to feel, like I'm ready to, engage in this one-on-one time and use those strategies. And so I think that part of it is really important in terms of establishing the relationship, or if it's already been established, reinvigorating the warmth.
Totally. It's such an important point, and I think can be maybe not counterintuitive, but not necessarily the first thought people have, right? I think that there are some people for whom creating relationships with individual kids just comes naturally, and it's just something that they do.
Totally.
And for other teachers or people who are working in groups, it can feel it's just not necessarily the first thing. You want to impart knowledge, you want to help them succeed. But when you have a kid who is acting out, your first thought is not, let me become closer to this kid. And yet
Right.
that is it's really so powerful, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And
Yeah. And that goes back to like the problem solving, like fixer in us, right? Like, oh, this kid is calling out, I need to fix it by delivering that consequence, right? Or doing whatever that is, right? And so that's often where parents and teachers jump to, right? Because it's, again, like if you're sitting quietly and everyone's working nicely, like you don't need to say anything, right? It's all going well. But then that's such a missed opportunity to reinforce those behaviors that you are looking for.
Really.
How would
That's
they
a
know
really
that you
good
want
point.
that if you can't point it, if you're not pointing it out,
Absolutely. And that's not something that people think of necessarily either, right? Unless something is going wrong, to be able to take that moment and say, look at the great things that you guys are doing,
Right.
is something you really have to be taught and to teach yourself and to reinforce in yourself to remember to do those things.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think all of these problems are really compounded sometimes by the mantle of authority that
Mhm.
teachers feel like they have to wear. And especially, I think, for people who are new to the craft, who are still trying to learn, figure out how to do all of this. They don't teach behavior management in
Right.
in degree programs at all, or very little. And then so to come in and be ready to teach a kid all of this knowledge, but then have to manage all of these behaviors, and you're dealing with your own sense of insecurity of like, how do I keep control of this class? And they have to see me as an
Totally.
authority and they have to respect me. And your first instinct is to be the bigger, more
Exert. Yeah, right.
intimidating. Yeah, exactly. Right. And in some ways, I think it does feel kind of counterintuitive to think I have to step back. I have to praise these positive behaviors, which they should be doing anyway. So why do I have
Yeah,
to
it
point
makes
it out?
sense on paper. Totally. And I think that happens for parents too, right? Like a lot of parents will say like, well, they have to listen to me because I'm the parent, or it feels like I'm letting them get away with something by ignoring that. And teachers feel that way too. And, I think it really does take a lot of work to kind of remember, like, you're not letting them get away with it. You're waiting for the positive behavior so that you can reinforce that, right? And so I think that that's a really big challenge for teachers and parents, because they are in some level of an authority, some authority role, right? And so how you manage that with the relationship building, and feeling like that person at the front of the classroom, or the parent in charge on a play date, or an after school activity or something like that. And I think that kind of goes back to my first point too, of thinking of like what you're bringing to the environment, right? Like how you're coming across in that space as like an authoritative figure or more permissive, and then kind of how that all pans out, and thinking about the ways that you're interacting with kids because of your biases or that own
Your own.
insecurity. Right.
Totally.
And there is no like rule book for parents either. So it's the same with teachers, where it's like, well, I thought I was doing all these other things. I thought I had to teach them social studies, or parents said I thought I just had to feed them or whatever it was, right? And then it's all this other stuff that we don't think to teach them because it comes naturally to us, right? Of like, oh, of course I'm getting ready for my next transition. I have to remember to go to the bathroom before I get in the car. And that's just not baked into their brains yet.
Totally. So, we hear a lot from teachers, for example, of how most of the group is doing what they're supposed to do. And then there's always the one kid, the one kid that sort of throws off everything, that draws a lot of the teacher's attention to trying to manage the one kid who other kids start to copy, or other kids are starting to egg on maybe the one kid. I know this is hard, and so I don't expect you to have all the answers, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts about how teachers manage the one kid without singling them out in any sort of shaming way, without embarrassing them, but still shaping their behavior. And also, frankly, in a way that doesn't punish the whole class. I do think that's an instinct sometimes too, that like, oh,
absolutely.
well, nobody's going to go out for recess until everybody settles down, which in turn just shames the kid. So anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, and I think there's, lots of opportunities there where teachers say they are punishing the whole class, and then, well, it was just so and so's fault, and then that just is going to increase the chance that they're ostracized in that way. So I think if you've already set up the stage for success, the kid understands the expectations, you're using some differential attention to ignore some of those negative behaviors, that might be a great place for an individualized behavior plan, right? And the behavior plan, yes, it is singling him out where it might be something that just he uses, he or she or they in the situation, obviously. But the behavior plan is intended to be entirely positive, right? We're not taking points away from them if they have a negative behavior. It's really just trying to catch them being positive, right? And to catch those, like all of the behaviors are framed for the positive, right? It's not like, and then if you yell, I'll take this away from you, right? It's that I would highly encourage people not to associate the consequences with the reward chart, right? Because we want it to remain entirely positive. That's why we frame the behaviors in the positive light. And so again, that's one way that, we might be even giving more of that important one-on-one attention, right? Not in a way that's ostracizing, but in a way that is, building that relationship piece with that child might need more one-on-one attention than other kids. And so trying to find ways to do that, whether that's, jumping into a game at recess or something like that. But again, that might be a great place for an individualized behavior plan. And it's intended to be entirely positive, right? So focusing on which positive behaviors you can reinforce in that situation. And then, with the idea that that's giving positive attention to it and it will increase those behaviors ultimately as well.
You started to talk about it a minute ago, but we have a question asking about like some suggestions for how teachers can build positive relationships with their students. What are some ideas that you have for, maybe lunch groups or one-on-one check-ins? You mentioned about starting a game at recess. Do you have any other ideas on what teachers can do? I mean, when they have so many other kids in the classroom, it's hard to carve out time for a single kid.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. I think it is really challenging and important to prioritize that. And I think that's kind of dependent on the kid's age and stage too, right? Like it might make sense to, start a game at recess or do something like a lunch club, or even just as they're working, kind of checking in on kids individually and providing that one-on-one attention. And again, thinking about what feels plausible within the settings that you're in, right? Like in a school setting, are there spaces where maybe part of the group goes to music and the other part goes to art? And so you can have a smaller group that in one class, and you can kind of, find those opportunities as well. It is really challenging, but it would be something that would be great to work with your school administration on, about how can I build in this one-on-one time, right? Like, what are some ways that they can be supportive of that as well? Because it is challenging when there's lots of kids and lots of things to do throughout the day. But, just getting creative about, if there's kids that show up a little bit early, right? Or, find those moments in between activities as well to kind of reinforce that.
Awesome. I love the idea of having the administration support you too, because I know sometimes teachers have a lot of autonomy, but they also sometimes can feel kind of their own little island. So having some administration help, but then also maybe some ideas from fellow teachers and stuff too can help as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
What do you think are some good ways of starting this regime, I guess, or this new way of thinking about behavior? Say you have a class and like there's some difficult patterns that are already really entrenched, and now you're learning this stuff for the first time and you really want to implement this in your classroom. What do you think is a good way to do that effectively?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it's November, not September, right? So, yeah, or
We should do this
August.
in late August, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. Next year, next year.
Yeah,
Um,
right.
but I have experience where I was running groups and it didn't feel like we had set anything up the right way. And we just started over, right? Like, we just said, all right, we really need to think about what expectations we have for each other and for the class. And so it's never too late to start. Right now is better than never. And so I think having that kind of sit down conversation is saying, all right, these are the expectations, knowing that it will take a while for that to kick in for the kids, right? Thinking about the extinction burst, but also just thinking about how long it takes for kids to learn things and generalize things. So starting in November, you might see compliance later, obviously, than you would have if it were September. But I think just making sure you probably already have a lot of this built into your school schedule already, right? Like things that they do when they come to sit down at the when they come to sit down at their table, right? Or what they do when they enter the classroom, right? Do they take their jacket off? Do they put their backpack somewhere specific? Do they have lockers, right? Like all of those kinds of things. Thinking about what you have and then making the visuals and going over them and establishing that routine. It's the same with like a play date too, right? Think about as you're walking to the play date, right? Okay, at the park, remember we have a safe body. We use kind words and we listen to the adults, right? Even every time you're going to the park, you can do that. And it's again, feels like a silly thing. Like, of course they know that and they do, right? But just making sure that you're also setting yourself up, right? Giving yourself more opportunities for that compliance as well. And again, it's not a cure-all, but for teachers who might be saying, all right, I wish I'd had a visual schedule from day one, it's certainly not too late to start and to just teach kids through that as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Maddy. One person asks, what's a good way, or do you have any suggestions on how to coach teachers to handle behavior charts and plans in a way that is private for the student, and that also doesn't raise the specter of other kids who don't need a behavior plan, for example, getting maybe bitter about the fact that this kid is acting out, but he's getting rewards and I am doing the right thing and I'm not. Like, do you have any suggestions on how to communicate that to teachers?
Yeah, I think, part of it will be, again, kind of thinking about what is within your school's practices, and how that's being implemented. But I think it's also really helpful, just again, depending on the age of the kids too, just to think about like what and people, like everyone needs different things, right? Like some people need glasses and some people need wheelchairs and some people need behavior charts, right? And so kind of thinking about it in that respect,
That's a good
it's not
metaphor,
always
yeah.
fair. It's not, it's not, not everyone gets the same things all the time, right? People get what they need. And so thinking about it that way, but they're also, the teacher could have the behavior chart on their desk and be rewarding points throughout the day and just following up with the praise. And then that reviewing and revising stage of behavior plan implementation can be done individually, right? That shouldn't, of course, be like projected to the entire class, right? Like, all right, Chase got 10 points today. Bryce only got 5, right? Like, I'm by no means am I suggesting that.
Everyone
Yeah.
watch Chase today.
Right.
Sure
Everyone keep an eye out for Chase. Exactly. So, having that should obviously be private. And again, I think that's something that, is something you could talk to your administration about too, right? Like, are there ways that teachers have done this successfully in the past? Or are there interns or, grad students, student teachers that can help with that, and give that kind of, again, that's so classroom dependent. And so I'm hesitant to say kind of like a blanket, way to implement it. But I do think that, there are a lot of things that, it's helpful to remember the resources that you have in terms of like, if you do need a school consultation from someone like us, if you do need to go to the administration, if you want parents to be like delivering rewards at home, and it's just kind of like writing a report at the end of the day, like, you know, Mandy did such an amazing job listening, right? And so that means when she gets home, she gets dessert, right? Or something like that. You know, having the parents kind of implement it can help it feel more like private and individualized as well. Obviously, you lose the immediacy, but if the praise is there immediately, it can be really reinforcing too. Does that make sense?
Awesome. Totally. We are almost out of time, so I'm just going to ask, well, we are already over time, actually. I'm just going to ask one more question. You know, a lot of what you've been talking about so far really naturally applies to elementary school and younger kids, but do you think that all of this works with older kids too, middle school kids, high school kids? They're probably not acting out in the same ways, but they have their own ways of pulling attention and detracting from the rest of the group and all of that. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's you know, really natural to think of this as something that works for younger kids, but it does work really well for older kids too, right? So thinking about even adults love praise and attention, right? So teenagers do too. And so finding, you know, especially in the setting up expectation part, again, the expectations might look totally different for a 10th grader than a first grader, but you know, you still want them to understand what the expectations are there. Same with you know, thinking about ways that you can praise. And again, like great job listening doesn't feel great to a 15-year-old, but that might be a thumbs up or a high five, right? Thinking about ways that you can adapt that to make it not feel so weird for an older kid is certainly part of that. And then behavior charts too. Obviously, the examples that I gave were for younger kids, but with an older kid, you could break it down by each period that there might be earning some sort of point or reinforcement. It might be like a check mark from a teacher in each class, and at the end of the day, they bring it to the guidance counselor or their advisor or homeroom teacher, and they get that sort of reinforcement. And that might be a little bit more, you know, subtle than, you know, having it taped to their desk, which, you know, they can't carry their desk around all day. Obviously, that's for younger kids. And so it's certainly, you know, the strategies are applicable across the board. And just thinking about ways to adapt that to make it make sense for teens as well might be, you know, having it be more simply per period or class that they're in or whatever it is. And then also just thinking about how you're making praise genuine for a 5-year-old versus a 15-year-old too.
Totally. And using lots of that attention towards the things that you want to reinforce.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this, Maddy. It was really awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks to everyone for joining us. Please feel free to pass this. I'm going to be sending the recording and the slides to everyone who registered. So please feel free to pass this around to anybody who's interested. We will also post it on our website and it'll be available to everyone who wants to rewatch it. Make sure to come again next month when on December 8th, when neuropsychologist Dr. Natasha Brown is going to be talking about how to manage concussions. And please feel free to reach out to us here at Small Brooklyn Psychology for more help as needed. Thanks as always to Park Slope parents for helping us to get the word out about our series. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Thanks, Mandy.